In the sweltering heat of 1872, New Orleans streets shimmered with humidity and the distant tolling of church bells, masking the scent of decay that lingered in alleyways. In the crowded wards of Charity Hospital, doctors pronounced a boy dead, pale, stiff, his body unnervingly cold, his chest unmoving as the world carried on outside. But that night, under the dim light of lanterns and the mournful hum of the city, the boy retained. No one opened the morgue doors, no one tampered with the body, yet he stayed, eyes wide, whispering words no child should know. His voice was low, insistent, carrying secrets that rattled the living, names, places, truths hidden deep within New Orleans' shadowed streets. The doctors, the priests, even his own family recoiled in disbelief. What had he seen in the space between death and life? And what dark knowledge had he brought back with him? In the summer of 1872, Charity Hospital bustled with the sounds of the sick and dying, a constant mixture of groans, whispered prayers, and the metallic clang of surgical instruments. The heat pressed against the brick walls, carrying with it the mingled odors of medicinal herbs, disinfectant, and decay. It was in this oppressive atmosphere that young Julien Dupree, a boy of no more than 10, was admitted after a sudden fever struck him in the narrow quarters of the French Quarter. Within days, his condition deteriorated, leaving him pale, barely breathing, and unresponsive. On a sweltering July afternoon, the doctors declared him dead. Father Baptiste, who had administered the last rites, placed his hand gently on the boy's chest, pronouncing his soul departed. Nurses wept quietly, while his mother, Claudine Dupree, clutched her rosary with trembling fingers, her tears falling on the thin hospital sheets. Julien's small body was transferred to the morgue, a dimly lit chamber beneath the hospital, lined with iron tables and cold stone floors. The air smelled of formaldehyde, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of death itself. The morgue keeper, a wiry man named Henri, had long grown accustomed to silence and stillness, yet something about Julien's body unsettled him. The boy's hands were rigid, fingers curled unnaturally, and his face, though calm in death, seemed almost aware. Henri shook off the unease, believing it to be his imagination, and left the doors locked, confident that the boy would not stay. Night fell over New Orleans, and the city streets hummed with life, horse-drawn carriages clattering, jazz beginning to echo faintly from hidden parlors, and the river whispering against the docks. Inside the hospital, shadows lengthened across the morgue, and the stillness became heavier, more suffocating. Then, a faint shiver passed through the room, like a breath that should not have been. Julien's eyes fluttered. A sound, low and trembling, escaped his lips, a whisper so soft it could have been the wind. Henri, returning to check the chamber, froze. The boy was alive, not as the sick or the weak, but awake, alert, and trembling with knowledge that seemed far beyond his years. Julien began to whisper again, words that rattled Henri to the core. The names of patients, secrets of doctors, murmurs of the city, things no child should know. And as dawn approached, a single question lingered in the stale morgue air. Where had Julien been, and what had he learned between life and death? The morgue was meant to be a place of stillness, a silent tomb for those whose bodies had abandoned them. Yet Julien's return shattered that expectation. No one had opened the iron doors. No hand had stirred the sheets. For 12 long hours, the boy had been pronounced dead. Yet now he lay on the cold stone table, blinking in confusion and murmuring words that made Henri's skin crawl. Doctors rushed to the scene, their skepticism clashing with the undeniable truth. The boy's pulse thumped weakly but steadily, his chest rising and falling with life that should have ceased. Dr. Auguste Morel, the chief physician, examined Julien with a meticulous but uneasy gaze. "Impossible," he muttered, tracing the boy's pulse, counting breaths, checking for signs of rigor mortis. There should have been none. The body had grown stiff, the lips pale, the nails cold. Yet somehow, some force had returned him to the realm of the living. The notion was almost sacrilegious, and yet every measurement confirmed it. Julien Dupree had crossed the boundary that separates life from death, and retained. Claudine Dupree, the boy's mother, arrived at the hospital, guided by anxious neighbors. When she saw him, her hands flew to her mouth. Her son was alive, yes, but different. His eyes, wide and unblinking, held an intensity that pierced her soul. "Maman," he whispered, in a voice far deeper than a 10-year-old's, They are everywhere. Claudine recoiled, unable to comprehend whether the words were delirium or revelation. The doctors debated quietly, citing fever-induced delirium, trauma, and hypothermia. But even they could not explain the boy's knowledge. Julian began murmuring again, speaking of conversations that had occurred in other rooms, secrets only the dead or the dying could know, medical details of patients, murmured confessions from visitors, even crimes hidden in the shadowed streets of the quarter. Henri shivered as the boy whispered a detail only the morgue's attendants would know. The hidden pocket of a pocket watch belonging to a recently deceased man, stolen hours before death. As dusk settled over New Orleans, a creeping dread took hold. Julian's whispers grew urgent, almost insistent, recounting names, places, and events with terrifying precision. No one had taught him these things. No child could possess such knowledge. The city beyond the hospital hummed with its usual life, oblivious, while inside, the line between mortality and something far stranger blurred. And as night deepened, Julian turned his gaze to Dr. Morell, his voice low but commanding. "The dead, they speak. Will you listen?" Julian's murmurs were no longer mere whispers. They became a steady stream of revelations that hung heavy in the thick, humid air of the hospital. He spoke of hidden dealings in the alleys of the French Quarter, merchants cheating, debts owed to men long vanished, and whispered confessions that reached into the homes of the wealthy and destitute alike. The staff, initially skeptical, began to realize that the boy's words aligned with events that had previously gone unnoticed or unspoken. Every whisper carried truth, unsettling in its clarity, as if Julian had glimpsed the city's underbelly through eyes that had briefly seen beyond the veil. Dr. Morell grew increasingly disturbed. He had encountered delirium, hallucinations, and even the strange symptoms of yellow fever, yet nothing in his years could explain a 10-year-old recounting secrets he could not possibly know. The boy's descriptions extended beyond human knowledge, the exact layout of hidden courtyards, the names of long-dead parishioners, even minor scandals among hospital staff. Julian's murmurs suggested access to memories, or truths, that were not his own. Claudine Dupree, torn between fear and relief, observed her son with a mixture of awe and terror. Every time she asked him where he had been while the doctors declared him dead, he would tilt his head, eyes widening as if recalling a distant, incomprehensible place. "The walls," he whispered, "they hold the stories. The streets, the rooms, they all remember." The words chilled her to the bone. She began to suspect that Julian's brush with death had granted him a consciousness that pierced through ordinary barriers, allowing him to hear and know what the living and the dead tried to conceal. As night fell, Julian's murmurs grew darker. He spoke of unmarked graves in forgotten courtyards, of children whose cries had gone unheard, and of sins committed behind closed doors that had never been punished. Each revelation left the room vibrating with unease. The staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to dismiss the boy as a prodigy or to fear him as something more. And then Julian paused, staring toward the barred windows of the hospital. His voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "They are coming. You must be ready." The weight of the statement lingered in the room, heavy with dread. Even Dr. Morell, man of science and reason, felt a chill as if the walls themselves had listened and responded. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the boy who had returned from death with knowledge that no living mind could possess. Inside, every shadow seemed to pulse with a secret, one that Julian was now determined to reveal. The physicians of Charity Hospital were men of logic, accustomed to disease, decay, and death. Yet Julian's case defied every principle they had studied. Dr. Morell convened his colleagues in the morgue, the very chamber where the boy had been declared lifeless only hours before. Lanterns flickered against the cold stone, casting long shadows across the walls, as though the room itself quivered in anticipation. Every man present felt the oppressive weight of the impossible. A child returned from death, yet carrying knowledge and awareness that seemed beyond human comprehension. Julian lay on the examination table, small and frail, yet alert. His eyes, unusually bright and unblinking, scanned the room as if cataloging every detail. When Dr. Morell asked him to recount what he had experienced in the hours he was dead, the boy's lips barely moved. Then, softly, he began to whisper, names of doctors and nurses, their private thoughts, and intimate details of patients they had treated. It was not simply memory. The boy spoke with certainty about events he had never witnessed, recalling conversations behind closed doors, even minor errors in treatments that had gone unnoticed. The doctors scribbled notes in disbelief, some openly shaking. Medical theory offered no explanation. Rigor mortis, hypoxia, or even fever-induced delirium could not account for the boy's precise knowledge and alert cognition. One nurse, pale and trembling, murmured that he was listening to voices that are not ours. Dr. Morell, though steeped in reason, began to wonder if Julian's brief passage beyond life had granted him insight into truths inaccessible to the living. Claudine watched her son with fear and reverence. She had endured the terror of believing him dead, only to see him return with a mind sharpened beyond what she could comprehend. Julian spoke of places in New Orleans that no child should know, unmarked graves in the city's oldest cemeteries, clandestine dealings along the Mississippi docks, and whispered secrets of families who had long assumed their misdeeds were hidden. Every revelation drew a shiver through the room, leaving no listener untouched by dread. By nightfall, the boy's murmurs became more urgent, almost pleading. "They are watching," he said, voice quivering, "and they are not dead like me. You must see, you must hear." The doctors exchanged uneasy glances. Logic had failed them. Reason had no hold over the whispers of a boy who had returned from the threshold of death. Outside, the city streets glistened with rain, reflecting gaslight and shadow alike. Inside, Julian's presence unsettled time itself, bending the walls of reality within the morgue. And in that tension, one question hung in the air. Had the boy merely survived, or had he brought back something far more terrifying than life itself? As the night stretched on in Charity Hospital, Julian's whispers grew more insistent, threading themselves into the very fabric of the building. Nurses swore that doors creaked open without wind, and shadows flickered where no lantern shone. His voice, soft yet unyielding, carried truths no living child could have known, naming patients who had died weeks prior, detailing hidden illnesses, and even revealing confessions whispered to priests under the seal of secrecy. The boy had become a bridge between the living and the dead, a conduit of the city's unspoken, buried, and forbidden knowledge. Dr. Morell observed Julian with a mixture of scientific fascination and mounting dread. He recorded the boy's statements meticulously, yet each entry only deepened the impossibility of the situation. "It is as if he has walked through the walls of death itself," he muttered to a colleague one evening, glancing uneasily at the shadows pooling around the edges of the morgue. Other doctors avoided the boy entirely, citing discomfort or superstition, yet no one could deny the accuracy of his revelations. Claudine Dupree began to notice subtle changes in her son. His eyes seemed to see layers of the world hidden to ordinary vision. He often spoke to people who were not present, his lips moving in low, murmured phrases that chilled her to the bone. Occasionally, he would trace patterns on walls, tapping rhythms no one could interpret, as if decoding messages invisible to the living. The house that held his body was no longer merely a shelter. It had become a vessel for knowledge that defied reason. Even the hospital's atmosphere seemed altered. Staff reported cold drafts in rooms with closed windows, faint footsteps when no one moved, and a low hum, almost melodic, that seemed to resonate from Julian himself. Some whispered that the boy had been touched by forces that did not belong to the mortal world, a child marked by death and returned with insight that should not have been granted. One evening, Julian paused mid-whisper and stared toward the iron morgue doors. His voice dropped to a tremulous, urgent tone. "They are coming. Not the dead you can see. Something else waits." A shiver passed through the room. Even the rational Dr. Morell felt a creeping dread. The city outside hummed with life, oblivious, while within, the boy's words carried the weight of secrets that the living were never meant to know. And as the gas lamps flickered, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls, one certainty emerged. Julian was no longer simply a child returned from death. He was a warning, and whatever awaited beyond the morgue's walls would not remain silent for long. By late July, the unease surrounding Julian could no longer be contained within the hospital's walls. Strange occurrences began beyond the morgue. Figures glimpsed at alleyways, hooded shapes slipping silently through the quarter, and shadows that seemed to linger longer than natural light allowed. Julian himself became restless at night, pacing the narrow corridors with a deliberate rhythm, whispering names and events that the living could not have known. Claudine Dupree, exhausted and fearful, watched her son with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing that his return from death had bound him to forces she did not understand. One humid night, as cicadas droned outside and gas lamps cast flickering light through the streets, A group of visitors arrived at Charity Hospital. They were silent, their presence marked only by the faint rustle of cloaks and the occasional metallic glint in the lamplight. The doctors were wary, but Julian seemed to recognize them instantly, his eyes narrowing, pupils widening unnaturally as he murmured, "They've come, the ones who watch between the living and the dead." Dr. Morell, skeptical but unnerved, approached cautiously. The strangers spoke in low tones, their words carrying authority that made even the seasoned physician hesitate. They asked questions about the boy's condition, but their interest seemed far deeper than medical concern. Julian, seated on the edge of the morgue table, responded to them without hesitation, recounting details that seemed to terrify the visitors themselves. He spoke of corridors that had no doors, voices that existed beyond hearing, and knowledge that belonged neither to the living nor the dead. The hospital staff noticed that the air grew colder around the visitors, as if their presence drew a chill from the very stones. Shadows shifted unnaturally, elongating toward the boy as he described events that could not be explained by mere observation. Claudine's fear intensified. She realized that her son's survival had awakened attention from entities that were patient, watchful, and older than the streets of New Orleans themselves. By midnight, Julian's whispers became urgent, insistent. "They want what I know. They will not wait." The strangers exchanged glances, a flicker of unease passing among them despite their composed exterior. Dr. Morell, staring at the boy, felt the first true pang of fear in his rational life. Outside, the quarter remained alive with the usual bustle, oblivious to the events unfolding in the hospital. Inside, however, a quiet tension coiled around every wall, every shadow, every pulse of the boy who had returned from death, a tension that heralded the arrival of something far beyond human understanding. In the days following the visitor's arrival, it became impossible to regard Julian as merely a boy. His mind, sharpened by an encounter with death itself, had absorbed the city's hidden truths, yet it had also begun to reach beyond what any child could comprehend. He spoke of secrets buried deep in New Orleans, old debts, crimes left unpunished, whispered sins of both wealthy and poor, and of events that had transpired in places he could not possibly have seen. His voice carried a cadence that drew the living into his revelations, hypnotic yet disturbing. Dr. Morell, once a man of absolute reason, observed with a growing sense of unease. He tried to test Julian, asking him questions no child could answer. Julian responded with unnerving accuracy, recounting conversations the doctors had held in private, detailing mistakes in procedures, and predicting outcomes of patients yet to arrive. His knowledge seemed endless, unbound by conventional learning or memory. "It is as if death itself has taught him," Dr. Morell whispered to Henri, the morgue attendant, who nodded grimly. Claudine watched her son with a mixture of fear and reverence. She had nurtured him through illness, through secrecy, through whispers and shadows. Yet now she understood that Julian's return had transformed him. He was no longer only vulnerable flesh and bone. He had become a vessel for something beyond the living, a repository of the unseen, a witness to forces the city ignored. Julian's whispers extended beyond the walls of the hospital. At night, he would murmur directions and warnings, naming individuals whose lives teetered on hidden precipices. Staff reported hearing him converse with entities unseen, sometimes responding to questions that no voice had asked aloud. His deformities, slight of frame but marked by an intensity that unnerved observers, seemed almost inconsequential compared to the aura of comprehension he now carried. And yet, a quiet dread lingered. Julian had glimpsed not only life and death but the threads connecting them, and he carried knowledge that could unravel the very social fabric of New Orleans. When he paused mid-whisper, staring toward the barred windows, his voice trembled. "They are near. Not all dead return in silence." Even the city outside, alive with music, merchants, and clatter, could not mask the tremor of fate that had touched this boy. Julien Dupree, who had returned from the morgue, had become a harbinger, a reminder that knowledge gained from the threshold of death is never without consequence. By the end of July, Julian's whispers had grown into full confessions, spilling secrets that no one alive should have known. The boy would wake in the dead of night, his eyes wide and gleaming, muttering names of people long thought safe from scrutiny. Nurses reported faint, urgent tapping along the walls, punctuated by his low, deliberate murmurs. "They cannot hide," he would whisper, voice trembling yet commanding. "I have seen everything." Claudine, exhausted and fearful, clutched her son's small frame, unsure whether to weep with relief or with terror. Dr. Morell insisted on documenting every revelation, though he knew some truths were impossible to record. Julian spoke of clandestine dealings along the Mississippi docks, of bodies hidden beneath rotting wharves, of the final confessions of the dying whispered into empty corridors. Each detail was precise, each memory verified against hospital records or city reports, a frightening confirmation that the boy's experience beyond death had granted him access to knowledge unreachable by the living. The boy did not rest. Even when exhausted, he would murmur to himself, or to shadows only he could see, recounting secrets of doctors, patients, and citizens alike. He spoke of events in the city that had occurred decades before his birth, as if his brief departure from life had allowed him to witness the hidden layers of time itself. One night, Julian stopped mid-whisper and looked directly at Dr. Morell, his small hand raised as if to prevent any interruption. "The dead are patient," he said, voice barely audible over the humid air. "They wait for justice, for recognition. I speak because they cannot. Will you listen?" The doctor, though trained in logic and reason, felt a shiver of dread. He realized that this was no longer a matter of medicine. Julian had become a vessel of something larger, something that transcended mortal understanding. Claudine could only watch, her heart heavy with both awe and horror. She had survived the terror of losing her son, only to witness him return bearing knowledge that fractured reality. The hospital walls seemed to vibrate faintly with each word, responding to Julian's revelations as if alive, acknowledging the weight of the truths he carried. And then, as the city slept beyond the tall windows, Julian fell silent, staring toward the barred entrance of the morgue. A whisper escaped his lips, faint and urgent, "They are nay, and not all who hear me survive." It was shortly after midnight when the first knock came, soft, deliberate, echoing through the stone halls of Charity Hospital. Julian stared immediately, sitting upright on the narrow bed, his eyes wide and alert. Claudine froze, heart hammering, and even Dr. Morell hesitated at the sound, sensing a weight beyond reason pressing against the doors. The knock came again, sharper this time, and a low wind seemed to follow, carrying with it a chill that made the lanterns flicker. Julian rose from the bed, moving with a quiet certainty that belied his small frame. "They are here," he whispered, his voice trembling yet filled with authority. "They came for what I know." Claudine clutched his arm, fear and disbelief mingling in her chest. She had seen the impossible, her son dead and alive, whispering knowledge no mortal could possess. And now, the shadows had arrived to claim him, or perhaps something far darker. Dr. Morell approached cautiously, examining the heavy wooden door. Nothing, no signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dim light, yet the sense of intrusion was undeniable. Julian moved to the window, eye scanning the street beyond, though the gas lamps illuminated nothing unusual. Yet he seemed aware of presence, movement, and intent far beyond human perception. The knocking intensified, now echoing from the iron morgue doors as well. Julian's whispers filled the room. "Do not open. They wait between walls. Patience is their cloak." The words chilled the air. Even the seasoned morgue attendant, Henri, felt a prickle along his spine. These were no ordinary visitors, no mere curiosity seekers from the quarter. They were drawn to the boy's survival, to the knowledge he carried, and perhaps to the very secret that death itself had bestowed upon him. Claudine held Julian close, whispering prayers, yet the boy's gaze remained fixed, unflinching. He moved to the center of the room, hands raised as if warding off invisible forces. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, twisting and flickering with a life of their own. Julian's murmurs grew insistent, rhythmical, almost like a chant, calling attention to things the living could not see. Then, in an instant, silence fell. The knocking ceased. The shadows seemed to recoil into corners. Julian's eyes, wide and unblinking, met Dr. Morell's with a clarity that spoke volumes. The visitors had not left, but the boy had seen them, understood them, and perhaps negotiated terms invisible to human comprehension. Outside, New Orleans slept, unaware of the forces that had brushed against its streets. Inside, Julian stood at the threshold of life and death, guardian and witness to secrets no mortal could hold. The days following the midnight visitation were tense and restless. Julian's whispers no longer paused. Even in daylight, they flowed like a river of knowledge, fragmented yet precise, recounting details of lives, deaths, and hidden deeds across New Orleans. Claudine watched her son with awe and fear. He was no longer simply her child, but a conduit, a vessel through which truths of the city, of death, and of forces unseen poured. The boy had survived the morgue, but survival had transformed him into something that defied ordinary understanding. Dr. Morell, once steadfast in his belief in science, struggled to reconcile logic with reality. He documented Julian's revelations with meticulous care, yet every recording only amplified the impossible nature of the situation. The boy described hidden passageways beneath the city, names of citizens long dead or vanished, and whispers of the dead that no living mind could have known. Each utterance carried an urgency, as if warning the living of unseen dangers lurking just beyond perception. One evening, Julian paused mid-whisper, eyes fixed on the barred windows. "They are patient," he said softly, voice low yet commanding. "They wait for those who hear, those who remember. The city forgets, but they do not." Claudine shivered, feeling a presence that stretched beyond her understanding. Even the hospital's air seemed heavier, vibrating faintly with the boy's warnings. The strangers who had arrived that night in July had not returned, yet their influence lingered. Julian's knowledge suggested that their reach extended into the city's shadowed corners, touching places and people invisible to the living. Henri, the morgue attendant, whispered to Dr. Morell, "The boy walks between worlds. Whatever follows him does too." Julian's body remained small, fragile, and deformed, but his presence had grown immense in scope. He moved through the hospital with an awareness that seemed to pierce walls and doors, attuned to threats and secrets no adult could detect. His whispers carried messages that the living were unprepared to hear, yet those who listened could feel their weight pressing on the soul. Claudine often asked him, trembling, what he saw. Julian would simply respond, "I saw the boundary, and they waited. I returned so you might know, but the knowing is heavier than life." And with that, he would return to his memoirs, recounting events, confessions, and secrets, drawing the living into the unseen web that stretched beyond the morgue and into the streets of New Orleans. The boy who had returned from the dead had become a warning, a bridge between life and the unknown, and the city itself would never be the same. By the end of the summer, Julian Dupree had become both legend and enigma within Charity Hospital. Staff no longer approached him without hesitation. Even Dr. Morell, once the most rational of men, regarded the boy with a quiet reverence. He had survived death, spoken truths no living mind could comprehend, and glimpsed shadows that lingered between worlds. Julian's whispers were now constant, a thread weaving the living and the dead into a tapestry of secrets and warnings. Claudine watched her son with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. Each revelation he offered carried weight, yet she understood that the boy bore a burden far heavier than any mortal child could endure. The city outside pulsed with life, oblivious to the unseen forces Julian described. Hidden debts, unmarked graves, clandestine sins, and spirits who lingered, patient and watchful. She began to understand that his survival was not merely a miracle, but a warning. Knowledge of the unseen comes at a cost, and those who carry it walk a precarious line between life and something older, something eternal. Dr. Morell continued to document Julian's murmurs, though he admitted to himself that science alone could not explain the boy. Julian spoke of names, places, and events that predated his birth, recounting them with unnerving accuracy. He whispered of courtyards and crypts where the dead lingered, of sins left unpunished, and of hidden truths the living preferred to forget. Even the mundane streets of New Orleans, once familiar, became a map of secrets and hidden forces in his recounting. As the weeks passed, Julian's whispers began to shape the hospital itself. Doors creaked in response to his voice, shadows seemed to linger and move at his insistence, and the air pulsed faintly with a rhythm no one could name. Those who encountered him felt the weight of knowledge pressing upon them, an almost physical sensation of inevitability. The boy had returned from death carrying the city's unseen history, a bridge between mortality and the eternal unknown. Claudine, realizing the impossibility of hiding him forever, allowed Julian to leave the hospital under careful watch. He walked the streets of the quarter, small yet commanding, bearing truths invisible to others. And though the city carried on in ignorance, those attuned to the whispers, those who had seen the boy returned, understood that life, death, and knowledge were bound in ways humanity was ill-prepared to witness. Julian Dupree, the boy who had returned from the morgue, became a living legend, a reminder that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we imagine, and that secrets unearthed by those who walk it can never be forgotten.